Warriors Against Nuclear Arms, Yalana, and of the Coordinating Committee of United for Peace and Justice. He received his BA in History from Yale and his JD from the University of California at Berkeley. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Ramana for the invitation to come up to University of British Columbia, where you may be shocked the weather has actually been far better than the weather I left behind in California, and also to Green College for the opportunity to be here this evening. And in this time of fragmented publics, it's always good to get out of our particular bubbles and get a chance to hear from other perspectives. And of course, I come from the United States, which is perhaps the most impermeable bubble of all. And in trying to describe our current moment, I've been finding a number of commentators have turned to Antonio Gramsci's concept of an interregnum. You know, he used the term to characterize the period as a time when the old order is dying and a new one cannot yet be born. And in such moments, Gramsci observed, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And we are, I think, in another such moment today. And I try to find my way through the chaos by following a method that's easy to formulate, but often hard to practice. Think the problem from the perspective of ordinary people rather than from the perspective of governments. And this tends to be particularly difficult when dealing with arms control and disarmament issues. Most of the current literature is written from the perspective of governments, or those who advise governments, or those who someday hope to advise governments. And in the absence of significant social movements for either disarmament or peace, it's hard to find much on such matters that's written from the perspective of the rest of us. So tonight, I'll first talk about what governments have been doing, a short tour of the current state of affairs with nuclear weapons, with disarmament in decline and arms racing once more on the rise. And I'll then turn to some thoughts about the kind of movements I think we might need to avert disaster in the short run and to create the conditions in the long run in which disarmament progress might be possible. So we're in a period that's hard to understand and one of quickening change. The relative decline of the US economy, the rise of new powers, and the determination of incumbent elites to hold on to their power and privilege has created conditions where the risk of war among nuclear-armed states once more is on the rise. In the United States and Europe, economic stagnation and deepening polarization of wealth have severely eroded the post-World War II political alignments. The rapid deterioration of the ecosystems we all depend on, with global warming only one piece of the larger picture, is intensifying conflicts both large and small. And for all of these reasons, we likely are moving from a long period of low political mobilization, largely devoid of mass social movements, into a period of higher mobilization and likely more movements. And for those who work on disarmament and other issues as well, our habits of work, our forms of organization, and even the skills and knowledge we have found most useful over the past quarter century or so must be reevaluated in light of the changes that are coming. We're now in a very different time from what we can think of in retrospect as the post-Cold War period. The conditions that may have opened up some opportunities for nuclear disarmament now are definitively in the past. The central feature of the post-Cold War period was the particular possibilities opened up by the end of the confrontation between the two military and economic systems dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. We can now see in retrospect that the only period in the nuclear age when there was a significant opportunity for disarmament was following fundamental social change in one of the leading nuclear powers. The collapse of the Soviet Union interrupted Russia's capacity to sustain a military confrontation with NATO and the West. It also profoundly transformed the international order of things, ending the ideological and, for a time, the central geopolitical conflicts that had driven nuclear arms racing. But that opportunity was squandered when the elites in the United States and Western Europe chose instead to exploit the disarray of the post-Soviet states for near-term economic and military advantage. There's little reason to believe that there will be any real progress towards disarmament in the absence of change in one or another of the nuclear armed powers, really the great powers that's of a similar magnitude. And so regardless of your perspective on international affairs, it's hard to deny that by no later than 2014, what might be called this post-Cold War period had ended. In the wake of the outbreak of armed conflict in the Ukraine and the growing tensions in Northeast Asia, it was clear that we were in a period of significantly increased antagonisms among the leading nuclear armed states. So again, whatever opportunities for elimination of nuclear weapons was specifically created by that post-Cold War moment had been missed. Some have compared the moment that we are in to the run-up to World War I, with new economic and military powers rising to challenge old ones and with potential flashpoints on the margins of declining great powers and their spheres of influence. But we're facing a new moment, and I think we obscure its nature in our still inadequate understanding of it if we leap to easy analogies. Perhaps the main parallel of this time to the first decade of the 20th century is its opacity and a sense that the power holders may understand the moment least of all. As the historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote about that time, what gave the period its peculiar tone and savor was that the coming cataclysms were both expected, misunderstood, and disbelieved. World War would come, but nobody, even the best of the prophets, really understood the kind of war it would be. And when the world finally stood on the brink, the decision makers rushed towards the abyss in utter disbelief. Now, all of this is happening in a world where there are still enough nuclear weapons to end civilization in short order. General George Lee Butler, who is a retired commander of U.S. Strategic Command, emphasized that it is imperative to recognize that all numbers of nuclear weapons above 0 are completely arbitrary, that against an urban target, 1 weapon represents an unacceptable horror, that 20 weapons would be sufficient to destroy the 12 largest Russian cities with a total population of 25 million people, 1/6 of the entire Russian population, and therefore that arsenals in the hundreds, much less the thousands, can serve no meaningful strategic purpose. A single U.S. ballistic missile submarine carries 80 to 90 nuclear warheads, each more than 6 times as powerful as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. The U.S. has 14 such submarines, 8 or 9 of them at sea at any given time. And this, of course, is only a fraction of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, which deploys approximately 1,750 nuclear bombs and warheads deliverable by aircraft and by submarine and land-based missiles, with about 2,000 or so more held in reserve. Russia's nuclear stockpile is similar in size. Those two countries together have about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. No other country has more than 300. The other 3 original nuclear-armed states, China, France, and the United Kingdom, all are estimated to have between 200 and 300. India and Pakistan, about 130 to 150 each. North Korea may have 10 to 20 nuclear weapons, but its capacity to deliver them via missile remains unclear. And even the relatively small arsenals of the lesser nuclear-armed states still pose extraordinary dangers. A nuclear war not initiated by either the United States or Russia, and even a nuclear exchange not involving either of them, could wreak unprecedented damage on humanity and on the biosphere on which we all depend. Climate experts estimate that a limited regional nuclear war in which 100 nuclear weapons were used could severely disrupt global climate for as much as a decade, causing crop failures and famines. These effects could last, again, as much as 10 years and would severely reduce global agricultural yields, pushing the billion people who already have marginal access to food really to the brink of famine. So after a rapid drawdown in the 1990s from the immense arsenals of the Cold War, what progress there has been on disarmament slowed to a stop in the 2000s. The last treaty controlling nuclear weapons, the US-Russia New START Treaty, that entered into force in 2011, did not require the destruction of a single bomb or warhead and placed no controls on the development of nuclear weapons with new capabilities. All of the nuclear-armed states are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, manifesting the intention to sustain them for decades to come. And the nuclear-armed militaries are not just replacing the nuclear weapons that they already have, but upgrading them to give them new capabilities. Even before Trump took office, US plans to modernize all three legs of the nuclear triad were underway. New ballistic missile submarines, long-range nuclear-capable bombers and air-launched cruise missiles, and concepts to modernize or replace the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile all were on the drawing board. And these programs, again, were not an initiative of the new administration. They were the continuation of long-standing efforts dating back to the Clinton administration when the initial decisions were made to commit to nuclear weapons despite the end of the Cold War. Modernizations already are well underway today for an upgraded nuclear bomb, the B-6112, that will have significantly better accuracy and a range of relatively low yields. And this would make that bomb a more usable nuclear weapon, one that lowers the fire break between conventional and nuclear war. And in addition, and perhaps most significant in terms of the US upgrades, the warheads carried by submarine-launched ballistic missiles have now been upgraded to give them improved ability to destroy hardened targets like land-based missile silos and hardened command posts. The authors of an in-depth piece about this in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists concluded that the growing capability of the US forward-deployed sea-based missiles could raise serious questions in the minds of Russian military planners and political leadership about US intentions, especially when seen in the context of growing US cyber, advanced conventional, and missile defense capabilities, almost certainly deepening mistrust and encouraging worst-case planning assumptions in Moscow. So as those authors noted, these new systems create new instabilities and unknowns and confrontations among nuclear-armed countries. Advances in nuclear weaponry are occurring in the context of a more general ramp-up of high-tech arms racing. Powerful, accurate, long-range strike systems face sophisticated air defenses and increasingly sophisticated missile defenses, all in a fog of electronic countermeasures and now cyber warfare, operating at a pace that defies human comprehension. With the increasing dependence of militaries, and particularly of the US military, on satellites for a wide range of military functions, we also can expect intensified military competition in space. So a nuclear war is not likely to begin with a bolt from the blue attack. It will begin when the rulers of one nuclear-armed state miscalculates the interests and fears of another, pushing some geopolitical gambit to the point where economic pressures, covert actions, low-level warfare, and displays of high-tech force spirals out of control, escalating into general war. The Trump administration has continued and expanded this modernization of US nuclear forces. In its February 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, it announced two new capabilities: a low-yield warhead deployed on submarine-launched missiles, which is, that program's now commenced, and a sea-based nuclear-armed cruise missile. A month later, in his 2018 annual presidential address, President Putin announced an array of new strategic weapons systems. These included a new very long-range multiple warhead missile that could take unconventional flight paths, a hypersonic maneuvering air-launched cruise missile, and a gliding maneuverable hypersonic delivery vehicle with a non-ballistic flight path. Similar hypersonic technologies, it should be noted, are being researched by both the United States and China. Two more exotic systems that caught the attention of both specialists and the general media are nuclear-powered cruise missiles that are claimed to have unlimited range and nuclear-powered unmanned underwater vehicles. The latter reportedly will carry warheads of 2 megatons or more and are intended to destroy harbors and coastal cities. This new round of weapons development caught most of the public by surprise. But it is an acceleration of arms racing that never really went away. The United States still has a considerable qualitative and quantitative edge in high-tech, non-nuclear weapon systems, many of them battle-tested in the decades of conventional wars during the post-Cold War period. Both Russia and China have responded to the U.S. advantage in advanced conventional forces and continued nuclear weapons modernization with their own efforts to field a variety of new nuclear and conventional systems. The Russian government also recently has justified its recently announced nuclear weapons systems by saying that they are measures needed to evade increasingly capable U.S. missile defenses. And that expanded U.S. missile defense development in turn is possible due to another critical step in the erosion of the Cold War arms control framework, the withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty by the Bush administration all the way back in 2001. The Trump administration has upped funding and announced new technology initiatives for ballistic missile defenses as part of its large across-the-board military spending increases. Now, whatever all these systems, whether they're really seen by these governments as a strategic necessity, or whether these developments are impelled by some combination of domestic political considerations, military-industrial complex pressures, this is the stuff that arms races are made of. The clear and undeniable resumption of arms racing by the most powerful states, together with the abandonment of key arms control measures by the United States, threatens to destroy the entire framework of nuclear arms control that was put in place during the Cold War. U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty, about which I'll talk a bit more, together with the general hostility of the current administration to all agreements that might limit U.S. military power, also calls into doubt prospects for the renewal of the New START Treaty in 2021. And New START, entered into by the Obama administration, is the last treaty placing limits on U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear weapons. This reversal of disarmament progress, represented both by the abandonment of treaties and also by this development of more capable nuclear weapons systems, also further undermines the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In that treaty, which has the most signatories of any treaty that concerns nuclear weapons, the vast majority of the world's countries agreed to forego possession of nuclear arms. The 5 original nuclear armed states, the United States, the Soviet Union, successor state is Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China, are all parties to the NPT. Article 6 of that treaty requires the nuclear armed treaty parties, quotes, to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. There are no negotiations to eliminate nuclear weapons in progress or on the horizon. And rather than ceasing the arms race at an early date, the 5 nuclear armed parties to the treaty all of whom joined it decades ago, have resumed arms racing once again. Now, looking for an alternative to disarmament forums like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that appeared to be permanently deadlocked. In the early 2010s, a group of countries began discussions on a treaty banning nuclear weapons, whether or not any of the nuclear-armed states wanted to participate in the process. This effort culminated in the approval of a text for a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons by 122 countries in July of 2017. And the treaty opened for signature a couple of months later in September 2017 and will become binding on the treaty parties after the 50th country has joined. So far, 22 countries have actually joined the treaties. 70 have taken the initial step of signing it. None of these countries are countries that have nuclear weapons. The United States, France, and the United Kingdom, promptly upon the approval of the original text, issued a joint statement rejecting the treaty, declaring that France, the United Kingdom, and the United States have not taken part in the negotiation of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become a party to it. They also rejected any possibility that the treaty might build or reinforce customary international norms against nuclear weapons, stating that we would not accept any claim that the treaty reflects or in any way contributes to the development of customary international law. Russia and China, and hence the whole P5, the original 5 nuclear-armed states, subsequently joined them in a statement of opposition to the new treaty. Now, the ban treaty effort likely was close to the limit of what could be done in nuclear disarmament work in the absence of a supporting mass movement. It developed an international network of NGOs employing skilled and dedicated campaigners with the support of some friendly governments. It helped to spark a series of high-profile international conferences on the consequences of nuclear warfare, and in doing so, helped to educate a new generation of activists. The kind of single-issue campaigning approach that resulted in the ban treaty was sufficient to gain the backing of the governments of some nuclear weapons-free countries. But without, I think, a far broader basis of social support, it is difficult to make significant disarmament progress in, the phone. Thank you. So anyway, without a whole lot more social support, it's hard to make meaningful disarmament progress in countries where nuclear weapons play a systemic role in military policies, national security ideologies, and the increasingly insular top tier of national economies. So the most recent adverse development in the world of arms control and disarmament is the US withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And that withdrawal was confirmed at the beginning of February. Now, the INF Treaty was agreed to in 1987 by the United States and the Soviet Union. It prohibits the two countries from deploying both nuclear and conventional missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The main reason that the US gives for withdrawal is that Russia had tested and deployed ground-launched cruise missiles that the treaty prohibits. Russia denied that the missiles violate the treaty and has in turn made its own accusations, foremost that the US ballistic missile defense launchers installed in Eastern Europe could be used to house treaty-prohibited cruise missiles. The INF Treaty allows either party to withdraw on 6 months' notice, quotes, if it decides that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of the treaty have jeopardized its supreme interests. The Trump administration has firmly asserted that Russia has violated the treaty, and the NATO states have backed that assertion. But the administration has not made the case that the missiles in question pose a threat that significantly affects the military balance between Russia and the very large and capable forces of the United States and its NATO allies, much less constitute an extraordinary development jeopardizing U.S. supreme interests. President Trump also indicated that withdrawal is premised in part on a buildup of intermediate range missiles by China, which is not a party to the treaty. Here, too, no case has been made that these missiles, which are based in China's national territory, are best answered by U.S. deployment of intermediate-range missiles. Nor has it been demonstrated that peace and stability in that region or in the world will be enhanced by repudiating the treaty, rather than seeking more comprehensive arms control measures aimed at breaking an emerging multipolar arms race. And further, in either Europe or in Northeast Asia, U.S. ground-based intermediate-range missiles would have to be deployed in other countries. This would likely spark opposition from their populations, a factor that 3 decades ago contributed to large movements that put the pressure on that helped lead to the negotiation of the original INF treaty in the first place. So that treaty should not be abandoned lightly. It's one of the few remaining agreements limiting nuclear weapons and arms racing. These kinds of missiles are often forward deployed and intermingled with other forces. And as a consequence, they are among the kinds of weapons that are most likely to lead to miscalculation or misadventure in a crisis. And this danger of crisis miscalculation, of a disastrous misunderstanding of an adversary's mindset, is real. At the time the INF Treaty was being negotiated in 1987, some U.S. strategists viewed their nuclear-armed missiles in Europe as useful for convincing demonstration shots to show a commitment to defend Europe with nuclear weapons with, they thought, less risk of escalation to a catastrophic nuclear war. A 1987 Washington Post article summarized NATO thinking. A final advantage of the INF weapons is that NATO planners believe they could use a single Pershing II or cruise missile rather than another nuclear weapon with somewhat less risk of triggering an all-out nuclear war. But we now know that Soviet military leaders, strongly influenced by the World War II national trauma of a homeland devastated and millions dead, saw things quite differently. Alexei Arbatov, a Russian arms negotiator and parliamentarian, recently noted that in 1983, Marshal Nikolai Argakov, the head of the Soviet General Staff, made clear that the Soviet Union would not allow itself to be taken by surprise, as it had been in 1941. Argakov stated, "We will start the offensive if we are obliged to do it, and as soon as we discover the first evidence of the beginning of nuclear attack by NATO. And in so doing," he said, "we will deliver dozens and if need be, 100 nuclear strikes to break through NATO's deep defense echelon." Arbatov accounted this little-known history in support of a critical, not much discussed point about arms control. Even when prospects for arms control are dim, constant efforts to negotiate create channels of communication that are invaluable in a crisis. They also build institutions devoted to understanding not only the capabilities of an adversary, but also their intentions, their fundamental interests, and their deepest fears. But a long hiatus in serious arms control efforts and a climate of deepening hostility have eroded the diplomatic and military-to-military contacts between Russia and the United States. And in the triumphalism of the long post-Cold War period, arms control institutions such as the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency were downgraded or allowed to atrophy. With tensions growing among nuclear-armed countries and potential flashpoints from Ukraine to the South China Sea, it is long past time to rebuild the mechanisms of governments and particularly of the US government, to negotiate regularly with their nuclear-armed adversaries. So now I'd like to say a bit about our work, about disarmament work going forward. A starting point for work focusing on nuclear weapons and disarmament is to try to talk about them in ways that reflect the realities of power. Even disarmament activists who live in nuclear-armed countries often talk about our nuclear weapons and talk about countries as if they were individuals that speak with a single voice. But the vast majority of people in nuclear-armed countries have no voice whatsoever in decisions about their nuclear weapons. The decisions by governments to acquire nuclear weapons are among the least democratic decisions that they make. They have been made by small numbers of powerful people, acting for the most part in secret. Rulers who are willing to risk war among nuclear-armed countries also must have an enormously inflated sense of their own significance. They must consider it worth risking the annihilation of the people to preserve the state and to defend the order of things in which they rule. It was no coincidence that the most intense moments of resistance to nuclear weapons during the Cold War was the Euro missile crisis of the 1980s, the movement opposed to the missiles eventually banned by the INF Treaty. The inhabitants of NATO countries hosting US nuclear missiles faced the possibility that a nuclear war could be fought on their soil without even their government's consent. This raises a question too seldom asked by inhabitants of nuclear-armed countries. Whose weapons are they really? Whose interests do they protect? And this question leads naturally to others. As E.P. Thompson, a founder of European nuclear disarmament, asked in 1981, is nuclear war preferable to being overcome by the enemy? Are the deaths of 15 or 20 million and the utter destruction of the country preferable to an occupation which might offer the possibility after some years of resurgence and recuperation? And finally, are we ourselves prepared to endorse the use of such weapons against the innocent, the children, and the aged of an enemy? The people of every nuclear-armed country should be asking these questions today. Some of these same dynamics are now at work on the Korean Peninsula. South Koreans find themselves trapped between nuclear-armed adversaries, one of them an ally. The mass media in the United States portray the crisis as a confrontation between North Korea and the United States, and the efforts to resolve it mainly as a matter of personalized negotiations between Trump and Kim. South Korea is virtually invisible in this media frame, but it has been the government of South Korea that has taken the lead in seeking a diplomatic breakthrough that could end the immediate crisis and that might lead eventually to a more lasting peace on the peninsula. And it is also noteworthy that this current South Korean government was brought to power by a very large and determined democracy movement, one that rejected the long legacy of authoritarian governments closely tied to the United States. It will likely take movements of that magnitude or greater in many places if we are to reverse the dangerous slide into a new arms race. So we need to be thinking about both short-term measures to avert disaster and long-term strategies to address the causes of arms racing and war. First, this time around, I think we have to have more effective inside-outside strategies. Those who work for arms control and centers of power must remember that large, mobilized movements calling for fundamental change are really needed to move the boundaries of what is politically possible. Those working for that kind of deeper, broader change must recognize that it will take a long time and that more limited measures to stave off disaster are essential. We must be discerning about when to focus our energies on interim measures in a time when we need our main efforts to be aimed at building the social power to make real change. But because we once again are in a period when the first priority must be preventing wars among the countries that have nuclear weapons, we also need an approach that goes beyond single-issue disarmament advocacy. We need to focus more broadly on the forces driving high-tech militarism and war. We are, as I said earlier, I believe in a time of rising political mobilization after two or three decades largely without broad multi-issue movements in the nuclear armed states. And the potential for such movements, I think, is now there again. We will find, I think, that the way to make issues of war, peace, and disarmament a significant strand in these emerging movements is to explore the common causes of the dangers and injustices we are struggling against. The most influential campaigns against nuclear weapons in the past arose in times and places where there were movements of that kind. And a significant characteristic of those movements was reflection and discussion about the nature of the society that produced these terrible weapons and that systematically generates the risks of the wars in which they might be used. This included, again, the movement of the 1980s against US nuclear weapons in Europe. Writing at the height of that movement, Jürgen Habermas observed that it encompassed far more than a, quote, publicitary no to nuclear weapons. Rather, he wrote, many no's are aggregated in this movement. These included no's not only to nuclear weapons, but to nuclear power and to large-scale technology in general, no's to pollution and to the death of forests, no's to bureaucratic health care and slum clearance, no's to discrimination against women and to hatred of foreigners. Taken together, Habermas concluded, these no's were rooted in the rejection of an entire way of life tailored to the needs of a capitalist modernization process, programmed for possessive individualism, for values of material security, and for the strivings of competition and production, and which rests on the repression of both fear and the experience of death. This is consistent with my own experience in those years in those movements, and where we had concrete victories, such as stopping nuclear weapons deployment in the United States, they were achieved by drawing consciously on the broad, multi-issue character of the movements of that time. The time is ripe for broad movements joined in an effort to understand the common causes of the dangers and injustices that we've been struggling against separately up to now. Here, too, there are parallels to the past, but novel elements as well. The questions of peace, democracy, economic equality, and the ecological requisites for human survival never have been as inextricably linked as they are today. The ecological and economic challenges we face are both a cause and effect of the deteriorating political conditions that drive international conflict. The loss of varied human-scale organizations in the social and political world, combined with the concentration of economic power in organizations of ever greater scale and scope, has left us vulnerable to authoritarian politics. The dynamic that drives the global economy, endless competition for material wealth and social power, is straining the limits of the ecosystems we all depend on. Yet the main solution that government is offering us is to gird for more competition and for more war. And finally, we need to bring the problem of nationalism more to the forefront in our analysis and actions. The resurgence of extreme blood and soil type nationalism is one of the defining and most disturbing characteristics of this moment. And nationalism is the main way that governments set us against each other and mobilize us for war. Even in the earliest years of the atomic age, those who knew best the power of nuclear weapons understood their apocalyptic potential if conjoined with the types of nationalism and the forces that had ignited the two world wars. The Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, which included Albert Einstein and several of the physicists who had participated in the development of the atomic bomb, warned that through the release of atomic energy, our generation has brought into the world the most revolutionary force since prehistoric man's discovery of fire. This basic power of the universe cannot be fitted into the outmoded concept of narrow nationalisms. Today in the United States, understanding the so-called populism central to Trump's rise to power as a variety of extreme identity-based nationalism allows us to begin to understand its connection to the resurgence of similar developments elsewhere. Starting there, we can begin to explore the relationship between work against militarism and war and the resistance in the United States and elsewhere emerging from the experiences of groups who are being directly targeted. This allows us to see the same root causes in the global economic and political system driving similar ultranationalist forces in different places, and to recognize that ultimately the struggle against those causes must be global. It allows us to see where nationalist ideologies are being deployed in ways that increase the risk of war. Finally, calling blood and soil nationalism by its name when we see it at home helps us to identify allies and struggles against the rise of similar nationalisms elsewhere, and to begin to construct the renewed internationalism we need specific to this moment. The old blocs are gone, but the military-industrial complexes are not. They are, if anything, even more dangerous in combination with resurgent nationalisms in the service of competing constellations of capital. If resistance to the renewed militarism of the most powerful governments is to be effective, it must be aligned with none. E.P. Thompson's words on this point at the height of the Cold War still resonate. Only the regeneration of internationalism can possibly summon up a force sufficient to the need. This internationalism must be consciously anti-exterminist. It must embody in its thought, in its exchanges, in its gestures, and in its symbolic expressions, the imperatives of human ecological survival. That's it.